So let's get things started. Anne, I'm going to start with you, kind of following on from some of the questions and discussion we were having around the table at lunch. This issue around institutions and trust, your background has seen you in very senior positions across every sector, pretty much. So I'm interested in, how you think we go from this hopefully low point of lack of trust in business and government, and how we get to a better place where we can see these institutions working together. And maybe you might like to start from a business perspective on where you think business goes from where it is at the moment in terms of trust and its contribution to a reform agenda.
Thank you for the soft start. Look, I think it's a really difficult issue, but the start point has got to be that we accept there's a problem. And the boards that I'm on and the companies I'm involved in all do accept there's a problem. So I think that's the first thing, because you can't even really contemplate how you're going to fix it unless you accept that. And for a long time we haven't accepted it. We've just said people don't understand, or they didn't read the numbers, or we're trying, or whatever it is. But now I think everyone is saying we do have a problem. And the how you fix it varies a little from organisation to organisation. But at the end of the day, a lot of what needs to happen is very similar to what the report has called out, which is reconnecting with people. Because at the end of the day, our shareholders and our customers are often the same people, even though they theoretically behave differently. Most people who are shareholders, particularly through their super funds, don't believe that the organisation speaks to them as people. Because we've got so many intermediaries as well. You speak through advisors or shareholder organisations, or an army of people that nobody, who are retail shareholders particularly, know who they are. So there's quite a big disconnect where we've got to reconnect. And I think we've also got to put a much more human face on the decision making and impact of what we do. Because a lot of the lack of trust, particularly in banks, has, and we've been here before, strangely, is about not really connecting, saying we are thinking about customers but not behaving as though we're thinking about customers, saying we're doing the right thing and people don't believe it because it's not how they see it. So it's actually changing the mindset internally inside organisations to make it more people-oriented as well. So I think that's, business we've got a lot of work to do in business, because we've let it drift and drift and drift for a long time, and we've got to pull it back. And the cost of it is enormous. If you think of the cost of a Royal Commission, the Royal Commission to the banking sector in Australia is billions of dollars in fines and cost and outflow and all the stuff that's going on. So the cost is not insignificant of getting it wrong. And I think people are aware of that. And then finally on the institutional piece, which is what we were talking about, government and other big institutions, that's a weird combination of leadership, and business is a leadership issue as well, but political institutions, leadership is a huge issue. And how do you trust a place where the leader churns, seemingly for no apparent reason quite quickly? How do you trust institutions that are spending most of their time focused internally, not externally, which is where government agencies and everyone ends up when you've got ministers and everyone churning through. All of us who touch parts of government know that they're distracted constantly now. And the other thing, of course, where trust is lost is that if you're in the know, if you know how to get into a minister, if you know how to put a good deal on the table, if you know how to run a good idea, which you get because of proximity, you're probably likely to get it up. And then everyone else is going, well, how does that work in a system that's meant to be open, fair, blah, blah, blah. So I think in every area we need to get our house in order, because we can't do all this huge policy agenda without functioning institutions that people trust. And our economy has traditionally been built on functioning institutions that people trust. Without them, the rest of it feels like it's built on a house of cards.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. It's certainly one that we call out in the report, that Australia's institutions have been, the cornerstone of its success. I hark back to my days in the public sector when it seemed like there was a bit more of a commitment to some process, and, you know, certainty about how decisions were made. You know, how do we get back there, do you think? You've had a stellar career in the public sector as well. I mean, what sort of leadership do we need there?
Well, I mean, I don't know the quick answer to it, but I do think we need more collaboration. And traditionally, you know, governments have grown up believing that great wisdom sat inside government, and it did, and it has, and probably still does. But I don't think government can do it by itself anymore. So I think culturally, one of the challenges for both state and federal governments is how do you become more collaborative? How do you work more openly with your stakeholder partners? And again, we were talking earlier about the last time there was a really big policy agenda in Australia. It wasn't government doing it by itself. It was government with the narrative, but they did it jointly with unions, with business. You know, the old tripartite processes actually delivered us a lot, and delivered us a huge platform which we've sat on increasingly tentatively ever since, without that same collaboration being part of our agenda since. So I think there's, you know, no one sector now owns it, and so we've got to come together. But also, from the point of view of government, you know, a lot of the institutions that are meant to provide this policy leadership, the COAG, organisations. I mean, somebody at our table said, defined once as the place where good policy goes to die, when it was meant to be the opposite. It was meant to be where you brought good ideas to the table, all the states and Commonwealth worked on them and picked them up and worked out how to do it coherently across Australia. And that just hasn't happened for a long time. So you can't keep flogging that dead horse, hoping it's going to resuscitate, because I don't think it will. So the question is, what do you replace it with? How do you develop a mechanism that does bring different groups of people together around the table with the stated objective of doing things better and problem solving, rather than talking ad nauseum at meetings and nothing coming out the other end, other than a bland one-pager that took most of the meeting to agree?
Attila, I'm going to...
I've obviously been at too many of these.
No. Too many communiques with square brackets. Attila, your contribution to this report, I read very optimistically in many respects. You know, against the backdrop of so many people talking about the you know, hundreds of thousands of jobs that are going to be destroyed and rising unemployment and all the rest of it, you actually talked about the fact that there were going to be more people in work, that we're actually going to be struggling to find people to fill really important jobs, and in fact that not only would employment levels be high, I'm just looking at my notes here, but people will be engaged in more meaningful and creative roles, which I've found very exciting. But then you talked about the things that have to happen to get us there and to make sure that we actually can connect opportunities to people with the right skills. And you focus a lot as well on collaboration. So I was wondering if you might just give the audience a bit of a sense of what you think the really big issues are, and maybe talk a bit about some of the success that UTS has had.
Thanks. I mean, so first of all, I'd like to congratulate you on your whole report, because it does have a sense of optimism in it, and that we can do this. And that is very important, because I am an optimist about where we're going. As I said in my contribution, there can be a wonderful future, and I think the future is just in front of us. We can easily grasp it, but there are a number of things we have to do to take that future. But I think having a sense of optimism in the first place is an important part of getting us to that future. And similar to you talking, Anne, I think the collaboration is an important part of that. I think if we're complacent, if we think 27 years of uninterrupted economic growth gives us the right to forget about the future, that's where the dangers lie. So for me, I think the barriers aren't so much barriers that we have to be overcome, but barriers of complacency. We've had these wonderful, recently focused on the innovation agenda. Innovation is a core to the economy. But once again, unfortunately, I mean, the state is still doing some great work, but at the national level, that's fallen in the same hole as the 18 other innovation reports before. But they've got the right start, but if we could just keep pushing some of those, I think it's important. Similarly, if we look at, say, the future of work, people focus on jobs disappearing, but a whole lot more jobs will come. And the challenge we have is that parts of jobs will change. So say at UTS, what we do, how we teach a lawyer today versus how we taught a lawyer 5 years ago versus how we're going to teach a lawyer in 5 years' time or 10 years' time is very different skill sets, but they're still called a lawyer. But parts of their job are being automated away. Parts of their job have AI involved. So particularly for people in this room, it's the professions that are going under profound change in the next little while. And the way of dealing with this is to take this lifetime of learning, and I know you spoke about it in your report. It sounds trite because many of us have had a lot. We've all done ongoing education. I've got a couple of degrees. I've done umpteen number of professional development in my career. That is nothing compared to what the students who are going through university today will be. They will regard education as just this continuous journey. It's not seen in, phew, I've made it through primary school. Great, I've just made it through secondary school. Now I've got to decide what to do next. But they'll regard education as something that goes all the way through their life. And we're already starting to have these discussions, which is why I'm an optimist. We're starting to see a post-secondary educational world where university plays a role, TAFE and the vet sector plays a role, private providers play a role, and very, very importantly, corporations and employers play an absolutely critical role. And that's where the collaboration needs to be. So that when I graduate, say I'm a brand new student graduating, I will be of the mindset that I'll have to educate myself all the way through my life. I'll spend 30% more time than people today in education, and that's quite exciting. I get new skills, I get to do things, I get to do new and interesting jobs. But to get those skills are, I may go to university for part of it in modularised courses. I may go through a TAFE experience. I may go through a combined university, employer, private provider experience. It's a much more dynamic world than it's been in the past, and that's where I see the excitement is. And Australia's actually traditionally been quite good at this. So that's where I see the optimism. Where we've got to take the challenge is some of the policy behind that is often policy at the moment have wins and losers. They pit the vet sector versus private providers versus universities. And if we go down that route, we have lost. So if we go down the route of this collaboration, that's where we're going to get the real gains. I mean, for example, again at UTS, one of the things we've tried to do is move to every single one of our students has an internship. So we went from about 30% of our students having an internship during their time at university to about 85%. Now, the reason for that is because we believe that while you go through university, having a real experience of what industry is like, regardless of what that experience is, gives you insights that then enable you to go all the way through your careers. We've ripped out all our big lecture theatres. We've spent $1.5 billion on a campus to have more collaborative experiences, again to try and give our students these human experiences, because it's a human-human interaction, the creative problem solving, the ability to work with people in teams. They're the crux of what can't be automated out of your job. And the good news is when you do surveys, that's the part of the jobs that people like the most. So that's why I'm back to the optimist, is that if you think about all the things we're training people for in the future, it's the bits of their job that they like the most.
So, sorry, Andy.
So can I just to add to that, because it's a great point, and we released a report last week through the Male Champions of Change, actually encouraging organisations to engage in the conversation. Because I think the whole future of work discussion as well has become binary. Are you in the sector that's going to lose your job? Or are you going to be automated out? The reality is all the research says there's going to be more jobs, not less. But the jobs will be different. So it's about the transition issues from where we are to where we want to be, both inside organisations, across institutions, and working together to create a different sort of ecosystem. So I'm with you on that. I think business is already saying we're prepared to step up and join with other collaborators, universities, suppliers of whoever, technology businesses. How do we create the new world that we want where we want outputs that are good for our community, as opposed to how do we step back and go, woe is us. The technology wave came and we're sitting over here wondering what happened to us at the foot of the wave. So I think there's a great opportunity.
Well, that's a good segue that I can head your way, James, because I always find it interesting when you talk to people about workforce challenges and this pessimistic view about there's not going to be enough jobs, because as soon as you talk to anyone in human services, the conversation is the exact opposite, which is what is our strategic workforce plan, because we're going to really struggle to get the workers that we need, and how are we going to evolve models of service delivery to deal with increasing demand, the fact that we won't get enough people and all the rest of it. Now, PwC and James actually contributed to the research as well, and have done some tremendous work around the social infrastructure needs of Australia. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, you know, both those workforce challenges, but also the changes that we're going to need to make in that sector to get to the outcome sort of focus that Anne was talking about.
Yeah, sure. It'd be good to start off by saying that we've actually got a pretty good health, aged care, social sector to start with. I think most countries in the world would swap what we've got for what they've got. But I don't think that's any excuse not to look at the amazing pressures and changes of the present and the future and say, how could we do it so much better? Part of it is the way these sectors are structured, and I'm not just talking about health and aged care, but the same kind of things could apply in education or the justice system or the human services system, is we tend to focus at the acute end, so hospitals, and we fund them really well, and we tend to ignore relatively prevention and more community-based services, and that's got a historical basis to it, and it's also quite hard to change because of a lot of the interests. But our challenge is that as we have lived a lot longer, as we have a bigger ageing population, as our expectations about health have changed, as our population's got a growing, that system is becoming not the challenge of today. The challenge of today is more around chronic health, you know, obesity, not malnutrition, cancer and heart disease from lifestyle, you know, food and exercise largely, as well as genetics, but also mental health. So they're all chronic illnesses, and chronic illnesses you don't really treat so much in a hospital. That's where you end up sometimes. But so you've got this system that is not really fit for purpose. Now, when you look into the future and you sort of say, well, if we don't change, what's it going to cost? And the numbers very quickly become very large. The numbers both from a fiscal kind of economic point of view, the cost of doing things as we do them now, but also from a workforce point of view, the numbers are just huge. There's where we're going to get the 400,000 aged carers we need by 2040, or for example. So they're really, I think everybody who looks at it knows that it needs to change, and where it needs to change is to shift to be much more focused on the citizen and on populations, much more interested in prevention and early intervention, much more interested in doing things in communities rather than as a way of relieving the pressure on the hospital system, but also within the hospital system, using data, evidence, technology better, and connecting with that community and public health. So now none of that is particularly new. Anybody who's looked at these sectors in the last couple of decades kind of knows pretty much that's all quite well known. And I guess, if there's one thing to do, it would be how do you kickstart the innovation process? Because unless you have collaboration and innovation, particularly in a place space for all sorts of reasons, you just don't get started on climbing that mountain. So it's not so much, we don't worry in these sectors about the number of jobs, but we do worry about how can we afford as a society to provide better, more targeted services for people and to be able to afford that as a community.
Yeah, I think now I'm just giving the audience notice here. I'm going to say one thing and then you better shoot your hands up for question time. I think one of the interesting things that I've come to learn, and it's one of the reasons why we were so keen to put data at the forefront, is that data and transparency around outcomes, but also money spent, is really, really important, because if you want to do something differently and you don't have any information about how much is actually being spent now or what is really being done now or what the outcomes are, you're sort of pushing against nothing. So you might have a contrary view about how you can do something. You might have some great ideas about how you can deliver better outcomes. But unless you can present those as better than the alternative, it's really difficult to gain traction. And, I've called this out on the CEDA stage before that, one of the things that the New South Wales government has done in some of its place-based approaches is, in supporting place-based approaches, is actually share the data around what they were spending in that community, which then empowered the community to understand what was possible for them and what they could achieve. So, questions. If you have a question, just raise your hand. There's microphones around, and if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and where you're from, that would be great.
Good afternoon. My name's Charles Casaselli. I represent the Western Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils. Thank you very much. It was very interesting this morning. If you look at the New South Wales budget, I think it's got surpluses as far as the eye can see. If your eye can only see 4 years in advance, which is the forward estimates. So the budget is in a very healthy position. The next 4 years looks very healthy. And yet there are some very ugly numbers around communities around Western Sydney. We have obesity and diabetes problems. We have urban heat problems. We have lack of social infrastructure. The list goes on and on and on. If you look at social infrastructure alone, the deficit between now and 2036 is around about $1.5 billion. And yet we have a state budget in surplus, but we have communities in need in Western Sydney. Where's the disconnect? I don't think we need any more reviews to try and connect money in a budget, which is available, and communities in need. Is perhaps policy too important to be left to politicians?
I'll start, and I'm sure others will have a view on this as well. I think, and it picks up a point that was made a minute ago, the idea of place-based policy, rather than having a single view of whether it's health or education or housing or whatever it is, that you then try and roll out across a state as diverse as New South Wales, I think is absolutely under challenge, because it's those policies that have left the big holes in Western Sydney. Those communities haven't been organised in the same way. They've already got structural disadvantage. So that sort of idea of a state rollout, and even worse, a national rollout of policy, which we've seen the failing, say, in Indigenous policy nationally. I think that idea is absolutely up for grabs, because it has demonstrated again and again and again that it doesn't work. And the analysis with the data on place-based allows you to then start to concentrate resources in the areas where they're really needed, and maybe take them away from other areas. Because again, the idea that it's like smearing Vegemite on a piece of toast. You do it from end to end. Sometimes there's a corner that really needs a big dollop, to carry through that ridiculous analogy. But I don't know where I was going with that other than the smearing. But anyway, so I do think that place-based policy structure needs to be garnered a bit more. And Western Sydney is not a bad case in point either, because it's really been councils and businesses that have come together to say this isn't good enough, and social organisations, this isn't good enough and it needs to be dealt with differently. Has that unlocked the budget? I don't think it has yet. But I think that's the outcome you want, and the data will help. So having really good data about what's happening in Western Sydney and showing that publicly. We should all be ashamed in Sydney, sitting here in some of the most affluent parts of Australia, while we've got some of the poorest parts of Australia with kids living in abject poverty, not quite on our doorstep, but only 45 minutes drive away. And that, I think, needs to be called out, because that's not the Australia or the Sydney or the New South Wales any of us are aspiring to live in or to be part of.
But if we take it, I suppose, a little bit of what you're saying in terms of the collaboration. Yep. First of all, we need a new way of doing policy, and I think you spoke about it earlier on today. There's not these big policy levers, there's big policy things as deregulation, etc. But it has to be what we call nimble policy, so that has to be fixed, and that needs to be going a little bit like you're talking about, place-based. But the second part is, as much and as important as government policy is, we can't wait for it. And that's where I think a lot across Western Sydney and other parts, it is community groups, councils, businesses, universities who are using what I call direct action to make the change now. And that, I think, is going to be increasingly important. That's where we're driving. As a university in the past, 20, 30, 40 years ago, universities did really clever stuff, okay? We gave it to government, waited for them to make clever policy, and then society changed. We can't do that. Universities exist as public institutions. We exist for all society. And one of the things that we're changing a lot in the last few years, and UTS deliberately is doing, is how do we work directly with community groups? How do we work directly with councils? How do we work directly to garner like-minded groups of industry together and then make the changes we see, using the convening power of universities as institutions, not waiting for government policy. And please don't say I'm undermining the importance of government policy, but we have to have a lot more direct action if we want to solve the problems that today's society is facing.
There's a question here, I think.
Thank you. Elise Morgan from the ABC. Professor, you mentioned your excitement that people will continue to seek education, that they won't just do a degree, they will continue to seek more education throughout their lifespan, that they will be able to, change careers and change their skill set as the economy continues to develop. But it's really expensive to do that. How do we fund that? And is that a case of those who can will continue to do that and continue to face the new economy and benefit from it? And will we continue to see an increasing divide between the haves and the have-nots?
That is absolutely one of the dangers. So I paint the what I call the optimistic way of the future, okay, in that there's ways that we can actually solve these problems, where people right across the economy can get benefits that they've never had before, where people in jobs now that are mundane and marginal can actually get the skills to do far more fulfilling pieces of work. But that's where the policy and actually the direct action comes in. How do we think through what the case for the funding of that going forward is? Where for the first time in Australia having a really good debate around what postgraduate education looks like. Part of it is who pays for it. At the moment, there's students pay for some of it, government pays for some of it. One of the ones that I'm very excited about going future is the employees and what their responsibility is in terms of ongoing development of staff. One of the things I'm talking with many leaders in industry at the moment is one of their concerns is at the moment, and I paraphrase, if they've got an employee who doesn't have the skills, that doesn't matter, they can hire someone else who does. Whereas now they're realising that unless they develop that person in the future, they won't be there to exist. So the employees and the companies, even small businesses, are investing in their staff in a way that we haven't seen before. So there's no simple answer that's saying there'll be one funding mechanism by government. But we start having the conversation where we think through education is a lifetime. Let's not think about a funding bucket for primary school, a funding bucket for secondary school, a funding bucket for university. Let's think about education and the attitude of education from 0 to 100, that it goes across formal education, informal education, industry. Once we have that mindset, you can actually start getting the proper mechanisms to support that mindset to make sure that all parts of the economy benefit from it. Because that is a real concern I have. Unless we get that conversation right, the increase between the haves and have-nots will dramatically increase. That's one of the reasons why the innovation agenda failed, because it managed to get a good segment of our society scared about what innovation does. I use a very simple example. I think an automatic car would be awesome. It could do more work, driverless car on the way to and from work. But I've got a very close family friend who's a taxi driver, who's got a very different perspective of automated vehicles. So how do we make sure that all segments actually benefit from this? And it is a role of government as well as this direct action. I was giving a speech in Europe recently. One of the European ministers of technology there said his role is not just to help think through what the technology is facing his country was, but how does he join up all of his government to understand what the implications of that technology will have on society, and then put in the policy mechanisms in place to help society to adapt and thrive from that technological change.
Question at the back.
Hi, Sally Cruz from Nous Group. I would like to know what your perspective is on the Greater Sydney 3 Cities plan is, as well as the new legislation that's being looked at to move population quota from Commonwealth to state, and what your perspectives on those are and how that fits in with CEDA's findings.
I can kick off. Probably more on the second part of the question than the first. But I think, one of the things that we're trying to say, sorry, let me take one big step back. When we first started writing this report, we thought one of the things we were going to push hard on was the need for a population policy. And at that time, actually, it was just before all of a sudden everyone started talking about population policies, and then you start seeing them come up in state election conversations and all the rest of it. And And so it's interesting how quickly that's changed. The point that we're trying to make is that you can't have one strategy or policy that sits at one level of government that doesn't relate to what's happening in other levels of government. And the point that I was trying to make in my comments in my speech about the things that migrants are looking for, the same things that citizens are looking for, was to say that any strategy is going to have to address all of those questions, if you like, all those issues. So thinking that you set a quota in a particular state, or thinking that you're going to have a settlement policy that's going to have people locating in one particular place or another, is a really complex issue that has to take into account access to employment, access to critical services, affordability of housing, transport, and all of these things. So that's the real challenge, I think, is that, you know, how do you have a knitted together immigration and population strategy which is built on effective policies that work together? And I don't know if people in the room saw this a few months ago, but there was this fantastic case study in the town of Nil where they have actually resettled a group of migrants, refugees effectively. But when you read through this story that was about what the community had done in order to make that relatively small exercise work, it was really significant and profound. I mean, everyone in the community bought into this, and there were jobs, and there was housing, and there was community cohesion, and there was connectedness, and there was support. And so I guess that's what we're trying to say, is that yes, this is fundamentally important, but there's going to have to be some discipline around it, and governments are going to have to be held to account that the things that they're talking about are actually delivered and joined up.
Can I just address the first part of that question, which was more around cities? So more than 80% of our GDP comes out of cities, and a lot of the immigrants disproportionately flock to cities. Cities are under enormous pressure. We have some of the fastest growing cities in the world, in any developed nation, and they're getting to a point where a single centre, where a lot of those high value jobs are clustered, is just not viable anymore. And I think every city has to have a plan about how it becomes a polycentric city, about how it supports high quality, future oriented employment in numbers of parts of the city, usually clustered around where there's transport, clustered around where there's affordable housing, clustered around where there's vibrancy and amenity and culture, but also usually stacked around where there's universities and research and large corporations, and creating an innovation ecosystem. So I actually think each city has its own story to tell in that way. Sydney has its 3 cities. Melbourne is looking more at a radial model. They're just too big now and too spread out. And it's not just for the economy, it's unless you have high quality future oriented jobs within close travel distance, that's a huge social issue as well.
And the Committee for Sydney that did some of the work on the three clusters in Sydney, that really was as a result of talking to communities and looking, for example, west of Parramatta, where more than half the city lives, where not enough of the jobs were and not enough of the transport existed. And we're pushing suburban development further and further out, almost to touch the Southern Highlands in Sydney. And people are driving 2 hours to and from work because there's no transport and there's no jobs closer in. So you've got to fix those things for cities to be functional. People aren't going to stop wanting to live in cities, but they've got to work for them. They've got to be able to get to and from work. They've got to get jobs closer to where they live than 2 hours drive away. And I agree, and they've got to be centred around logical institutions. So, you know, the focus on Parramatta is logical. There's university, there's Westmead. There are big and very, there are high-paid jobs sitting in those clusters as well. It's not just about clustering people in relatively low-paid jobs either. Badgerys Creek and further out in Sydney gives a whole other job cluster now as well. And to try and get investment and services radiating out from those clusters will make Sydney much more livable for all those people who aren't within 5 k's of the CBD, you know, the handful of people who live within 5 k's of the CBD who've been making decisions about the rest of the universe. So it's about listening, talking, finding more lateral solutions and then connecting it up with transport, jobs, schools, housing, etc., that radiate out of that. So I think ultimately it will allow us to bring more people back into Sydney in a way that isn't just about congesting the city even more.
So I'm just going to let people know that Attila's going to go in about 5 minutes. So if you've got a question for Attila, get your hand up. And then there's a question here at the back.
Thank you, and thanks. I think this is... two questions. Where does, given the recent sense of urgency on climate risk, sit within this? And a practical other question, which is, what's the next steps? What are you doing with this piece of research now, and what would you ask us to do? Thanks.
Thanks for the Dorothy Dixer on the second part, and thanks for the first one. Well, one of the things that we talk about in the report around climate risk is actually also just to highlight that if you think about the resilience of Australia, there's environmental resilience and there's economic resilience as well. And, you know, most of the energy projections show that energy demand is going to increase. Energy exports from Australia are going to remain an important part of our economy. And one of the things we call out in the report is that a lot of companies are already facing questions around how they're responding to climate risk and emissions risk and all the rest of it. So it's why we do think there does need to be an approach in Australia that deals with energy and electricity security as well as emissions. So how much work we do in that, I'm not sure. What we were trying to focus on was the areas that we felt that when you looked across our membership, we felt the areas where we could influence things the most in terms of collaboration across our membership were the areas that we wanted to focus on. So in terms of where we go forward from here, and it's a little bit of an answer to the first question as well, we'll have our research agenda where we're going to be focusing on particular issues within each of the 5 elements of the policy stack that we called out. And if you have a look at the back of the infographic, the sort of direction of things that we think need to happen are the areas that we're going to focus on. And we'll do that through our own research, and we'll do it through piloting some new forums, which comes to what we'd like people in this room to do and our wider membership and stakeholders. We want people to engage with us. We think that our organisation can get the insights from our membership in a way where we're thinking about what are the things we need to be responding to now and in the immediate future, that we get those insights, where we get insights on how they can work together to develop policy solutions, rather than, as we were talking about, sort of polishing the stone of the problem, actually trying to move to solutions, identifying barriers and how we can shift those barriers. So that's what we're trying to call out here, is that we think having government, business, academia, that's the insight that CEDA can bring. And so we're going to look to do that through our research, but also these sorts of events, this is our research event, but we also have hundreds of events across Australia every year. And that's a platform for us to raise issues that we might not focus on in our own research as well. So I fully expect that we'll have discussions around energy, environment, climate that will be up on the CEDA stage, and we use those to promote, we'll look to promote solutions there and to educate and to inform and to bring as many people into this conversation as we can. So that's the plan.
I was going to say, I think the challenge also, while the federal government has looked like they've failed in this space, it doesn't mean everyone else isn't working on it. So if you look at most of the businesses I'm involved in are working out how they reduce their footprint.
Absolutely.
The banks are looking at how they invest in alternate energy. There's a lot of activity that has as its core making Australia a bit more sustainable in this space. And the absence of the clarity of national policy is what's got most attention. It would be worthwhile. You could easily fill a room 5 times this size with people who are working on initiatives across industry, institutions that is starting to make an impact and will continue. So I think in the absence of there being clarity of national policy, we should get together the people who are doing the work day to day, and that might actually help create a better national narrative than the one we've got at the moment.
Any more questions? Sorry, just in the middle here.
Hi, my name's Alexandra Lobb. I'm from ACEL Allen Consulting. I just wanted to bring the conversation back to where we started with this issue of trust. So trust is a construct that we use to help us manage risk. In days gone by, it was only well, maybe not only, but primarily the educated people who were running big businesses or in academia or in positions in government that had access to the information to, I guess, translate that and be the provider of that information and hence command that trust. In today's space where there is just so much information out there and it's so easily accessible, how do we redefine trust, or how do we use the amount of information we have available to, I guess, help people to manage their risk better?
Great question. I think it's just the challenge of the day, really, because it requires all institutions, whether they're business, government or anyone else, to engage completely differently. You can't tell people that you're doing good things and they not be able to find out whether you're really doing good things or not. And so the mindset about that has to be fundamentally different. And that's the pivot point that everybody's suddenly getting to, is you can't tell, you can't control, you can't dictate, you can't do all the things that traditionally big institutions did, and to an audience who had much less information than you do. So you flip that on its head and assume that your audience has at least as much information as you do, if not more sometimes, because they get it from different sources. And you've got to not tell and dictate, but you've got to engage. And culturally, that is a massive shift inside many institutions and organisations. And it's not just business that's struggling with that, governments are struggling with that too, because people don't accept at face value what they're told, because they can Google it and find 20 other sources that either agree or disagree. So I just think that's the pivot point. It's not an easy path forward, but it's the path we've got to find a way forward on, because you cannot operate a high-functioning economy with lack of trust. You can't. And we all know that, and so we've got to find a different pathway. And there's a few of us in this room who've been involved, for example, in trying to encourage organisations to think about shared value as a concept and to reward companies who do it. And PwC have done some great work on that. And some of us that were judging it were looking at it going, why isn't 2/3 of Australia in this category, trying to think about how they create a different way of engaging with their stakeholder community. So I think it's early days, but we're not going to get there until we do completely shift mindset and assume that people have as much information as we do, maybe too much information to make sense of it, which is why good data becomes really important. So there's lots of chat about fact-based decision making. There's very little of it happens, actually. There's lots of facts, but not much decision making hangs off the back of it. So we've got to get better at that too.
Can I just make two observations on trust? One of them is that I don't think it's going to get better quickly. You've got people are more educated. There's so much more information out there. It's contestable in so many different ways. There's a plethora of institutions competing in the marketplace for trust and ideas. That's going to accelerate, and we're not going to go back at all. The second one is we're actually pretty well placed in Australia. It might feel like it's eroding, but if you go around the world, I think the level of trust, and I agree there's a one-to-one correlation between trust and a strong economy and a strong society, that we're actually not too bad as the world goes, and we should embrace that and take it further. And being responsible citizens, whether as an individual, in a business, in government, is intrinsic to that, and communicating that is really important.
So I think too, this issue around risk is really interesting, and Anne was talking earlier about new approaches through policy, and it's something I've seen as well, that there's a lot of risk aversion, right? And it's really interesting because I think in some ways the points that you're making, they go hand in glove in a really interesting way, which is we don't want to fail so we don't try different things, and we don't want people to challenge the fact that we're not doing different things, so we don't really tell them what's going on. And you sort of get this really unhelpful cycle. And so, ironically, I think, Anne was talking earlier about, so basically what she's saying is multi-stakeholder models of engagement, not single stakeholders. The Committee for Economic Development in the US, in its publication last year on sustaining capitalism, also spoke to this, which I thought was really interesting. So one, that's much harder. Two, you can't be talking out of one side to one stakeholder and saying something different to the others. So you're talking about a level of transparency that's different. You're talking about people taking risks and getting themselves out there, leadership, getting out there and having those conversations. And I think it requires them to take more risk in being honest about, or more open and honest about, what's working and what isn't working. Now, if Anne spoke about Indigenous policy. I get on my soapbox about this. The Productivity Commission found that something like 34 of 1,000 Indigenous programs have been properly evaluated, and then we wonder why we're not learning from program failure, or it's just outrageous. And so when you go in there and try to get people to take more risk, my point again, you're pushing up against nothing. So I think you rebuild trust by actually having more conversations, more honest conversations, but that's going to require people to take a bit more risk in how they communicate and be a bit more upfront about what they're trying to achieve, and putting good data out there that's meaningful rather than a whole wave of data that can mean anything or nothing. We probably have time maybe for one more question, or is that one more question? Otherwise, if we've talked everyone into submission, we can sit down and have an early cup of coffee.
Can I just finish with a cracking example of collaboration? Because there are great pockets of stuff. And I wear lots of hats, of course, but when Julie Bishop was Foreign Affairs Minister, she actually drove an innovation agenda through DFAT. And DFAT's pretty set in its ways. But this innovation exchange that was set up has been at the core of quite a lot of change in the way we think about delivery and outcomes. So through the innovation exchange, in partnership with UNICEF, which I happen to chair, one of the problems we're trying to solve is delivery of vaccines to babies all over the Pacific, in often very remote communities, because children in the Pacific die at rates that would make your hair stand on end because they're not vaccinated, and of preventable diseases. So how do you get to those remote islands? We've tried boats and people on their backs with ice packs, and you should see the stuff that goes on, days trekking through islands with an ice pack on your back. Anyway, we put it out through the Innovation Exchange as an idea publicly. Two young people in Melbourne have come up with a drone, they've adapted drone technology to allow the drone to carry refrigerated sachets of vaccine, which means when it arrives it's still usable, out, and it will travel up to 200 kilometres. So for the first time, we've got a technology solution linked to a policy agenda with an outcome through an NGO that allows delivery of vaccine to communities that have previously had no access to, the basic vaccines that all our babies get here. And it took a while for the Innovation Exchange to get going into the mindset of the because it's, what if we do stuff that fails? So we won't tell anyone. Nobody really knows about this Innovation Exchange unless you've had reason to touch it, which I have. But, unless you touch it and ask the right questions, we're trying to solve big problems that can't be solved the regular way. All the aid that's gone into the Pacific has not moved the dial one bit on maternal and child deaths. This is an opportunity to do it. And Technology Solutions, sitting in Melbourne with two 25-year-olds, has potentially solved it initially in the Pacific, but I can't tell you how excited UNICEF globally is about this, because it's a global solution as well for any remote community anywhere in the world. And so that's the power I think we need to start talking about harnessing. So that's government, NGO, private innovation, private capital, and risk, all bundled together to solve a completely intractable problem. And that's what the report says should be possible across so many of our sectors, and we've just got to put unlikely groups together to make it happen, and then we can have the next 27 years looking like the last 27, but potentially with much better outcome.
Well, Anne, I couldn't have asked for a better finish to our discussion. We got one more question? Sorry. Plus.
I'm Chris Guthrie from Liverpool City We live and breathe these problems every day out where I work. Our residents, we probably, I think I speak for them in saying that we think institutions have failed us out there for decades. I'm just wondering if, and congratulations on your work, it's really terrific to see you tackling these big problems. Just wonder if you'd comment on why you think institutions have dropped the ball so much for areas like Western Sydney and South Western Sydney.
Well, maybe not so much drop the ball, but I guess one perspective would be institutions tend to think from their own institutional perspective. And as Anne has really beautifully outlined, the problems we're trying to solve now can't be solved by one institution. It requires kind of collaboration between many. And so where you see the biggest gains is where you don't look at the institutions at all, actually. You look at the people and the population and the problem you're trying to solve, and then work back from there using technology, data, evidence, experience, and sort of say, well, what, how do we get from here to there? And so, that's why this place-based thing is so important, because it's about defining a population, defining a problem, and then working backwards. And that means you might have to change and bend the institutions. And it's really serving the purpose of the population and the purpose of the problem, not the purpose of the institution.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is that you look at what's happened so much in the past is you look at a community and you think, okay, so now we need to address education into this. Here's the education solution or policy approach, and here's the the social disadvantage or the unemployment solution, or and then here's the health solution, and then here's the transport solution or the affordable housing solution. And yet what everyone knows now is that all of those things intertwine. And what you tended to get was across the board sort of approaches, and not this sort of laser-like focus on, okay, well maybe we don't spend $10 for every person, we spend $2 on all these people because actually they're broadly okay, and then we spend $50 on this person, or this part of the community. And I think that's where we're getting to now, and that's what people are understanding better. And then the big shift from here is how you actually make that happen more consistently, which is about different frameworks for risk management, different capability within the public sector, different capabilities within the public sector, and quite frankly, a different culture in terms of how they engage with community, which is why putting community on a level playing field by giving them the same access to the information that you have is absolutely fundamental. Because if you don't do that, you can't behave as equals in the conversation, and that's what you need to get the better outcomes. So all these things have to happen. Where you see them, as Anne says, it's transformational, and it's so frustrating if you've had the opportunity to see them, because you can get better outcomes with less money, quite frankly. And anyone who's seen it is very passionate about trying to make sure more of it happens.
And you need someone to lead it. In Liverpool, in fact, some of the work at the Liverpool Neighbourhood Centre and Warwick Farm has been led through philanthropy. Hundreds of thousands of dollars of private philanthropy money goes in every year to step change what's happening, and suddenly the state government's noticed and they're starting to put more money in. So you just need someone to lead the charge on the idea of it, and amazingly people start to follow. And you need local leadership is the other thing, is to find, it's true in the Indigenous community, you've got to have great local leadership who's prepared to stand for their community, and then you can get people in behind. So I don't care who starts it, philanthropy, NGOs, government, but someone's got to start it, and then everyone loves a winner, right? And so if you can demonstrate that change can happen and that positive outcomes can be delivered, then you harness the circle of influence around that. And I think you've got a great example in your local community as well, but it came from philanthropy originally.
We are going to have to end there because otherwise we could go on all day long. Thanks, Megan.